As an orchestra teacher, I get into this habit too when I'm thinking about technique, and I'm thinking about force and vectors and how to apply pressure and all that kind of stuff. And so in this video, I kind of want to go over that a little bit. If it's not relevant to you, you can skip ahead to the next section or whatever, but I just want to establish what's happening with the left hand as we go through this series so that maybe it makes sense, or maybe you can think about it in a different way. So the first concept that I want to get across is that the moment equals distance times force. So what are we doing with the left hand? We're applying our fingers to a string, and we must push down that string in such a way that produces a resonant tone. If we don't have enough force, or we don't have the right kind of angle, or we're covering up other strings so those strings aren't ringing, it takes away from our tone. Often when we think about technique, we just think about the right hand, the bow, what the bow is doing. But a lot of our tone actually comes from the left hand too. So ultimately what we have to do is develop a setup so that we can push the string hard enough to create a resonant sound. Particularly for beginners, this is a difficult thing to do because they don't have a lot of finger strength and they don't have very good setup either generally. But that's where we can help them. So there's a lot of things in our setup that take away from force. And remember, the moment equals distance times force. So what's one of the things that we can control and affect? It's going to be the distance. So we have something called the moment arm. The moment arm goes from the fingertip all the way out into this meaty part of our hand. Our hand is divided into two segments. We have the thumb. So if you look at all of our fingers, we have one joint, two joints, three joints. Well, how come the thumb only has one joint, two joint? No, it has three joints too. This is a part of the thumb as well. So we can see how our hand bends this way. So this upper part of the hand, almost like the fourth joint where the metacarpals are right here. This is part of the moment arm as well. So we always have to be conscious of this. And when we solve for distance, this is part of the distance factor as well. Given our wrist angles and given our elbow position, sometimes we bend the wrist either too far back or too far forward. And what this does is it actually lengthens the moment arm, because if we're bending our wrist back this way, then the moment arm comes from here to here. So we've increased D in our equation. So now that means we either have less moment or we have less force, given all things are equal. Now, if a beginner can only push so hard, that means the moment is going to be affected, which means we're not going to get the best resonant tone that we can make. The wrist comes too far forward this way, again, we've lengthened the moment arm, and so we're going to have a reduction in force. When we have our wrist this way, our tone tends to be very thin, and our wrist is this way, it tends to kind of be nasally and sound like a duck. Okay, so it's very important to keep a straight wrist, okay? And it's important, the elbow angle is important too. Now, so when we're talking about violins and violas, when we reach to the lowest string, G string for violins or C string for violas, the elbow comes all the way in towards the belly button, and then we can swing the shoulder out. This is our shoulder rotation here, in and out, and that makes so that the moment arm is the same on every string. It's important that when we cross strings with the left hand that we do so with the shoulder and have that shoulder rotation, because if we don't, then we have to change the moment arm someplace else, either through the fingertips or through the wrist, and that's bad. For cellos and basses, it's the same thing. We want to make sure that our elbow's at a good angle. I want to make sure that it's not too high or that it's not too low, but we find that Goldilocks zone where it's just right. And just like in violins and violas, cellos and basses, they have to rotate the shoulder as they get to the other strings. This is not only going to affect our tone, but it will affect intonation as well. The reason why tone is underneath tuning on our hierarchy of skills is because if we don't have good tone, it makes tuning very difficult. If we're not set up to play with good tone with the left hand, it's going to be nearly impossible to play in tune. Now, can you do it? Can you still play in tune with really bad tone? Yes, I've heard some orchestras do it, but most of them don't. Most of them have either both or none of them. A particularly bad habit that violinists and violists get into is that left hand squeeze. You'll see the thumb start to hook. I call this hook thumb. That's one of my coaching methods when I'm with a group of students and I see the thumb start to come up and over. I just say, hooked thumb. And then everybody knows what I'm talking about. They know that they need to relax the thumb and not hook the thumb over, that they're squeezing too hard. With cellos and basses, a lot of time we can see the thumb peeking over the side of the neck, and we never want to see that. We always want the thumb to be in the center of the neck and even with the second finger. Now take a look here when the thumb on the cello goes even with the first finger, like it would with the violin and viola, instead of with the second finger. Can you see that tendon popping out and then coming back into position? That's not a good thing. That's creating tension in the wrist. That's why we need to always keep the thumb aligned with the second finger. And that is pretty much an absolute statement in everything except obviously not thumb position, but in all the different types of finger patterns. When we go to, like an extended pattern, augmented pattern, or as some of the books say, a 3/4 pattern, that thumb always needs to follow the second finger. We also need to understand that the left hand is fluid, just like the bow hand. If you take a snapshot of a great violinist and how they hold the violin, well, that doesn't tell you much. It tells you a moment in time. It doesn't tell you the whole story. So we could say, yes, the thumb is straight, the thumb is bent. We can have these arguments. Oh, the thumb is behind the first finger. The thumb is even with the first finger. The thumb is ahead of the first finger. Okay, if you watch all of the great players, their left hand is fluid. Their thumb moves around sometimes. Sometimes if they're playing an extended pattern or a high 3 or something, the thumb moves forward. If they're playing a low 1 or something, the thumb moves back to support that backwards extension. So it's not always necessarily in the same spot. When you're teaching beginners, it might be advantageous to keep that thumb on the first finger tape just for stability and developing the neuromuscular capabilities of being able to create some muscle memory for that spot. But as we get moving forward and start using independent fingerings, that could all change, and that's fine. The most important thing is that there's no squeeze and that there's no tension in the hand. Another side effect of bad setup or bad technique is that it's very difficult to play with vibrato. And I'm going to cover vibrato in a different section, not in this section because there's not enough time this week to cover that, but just be aware that all of these things that I'm talking about are going to set up students for good vibrato, which will affect tone as well. Another key point that we need to understand is that the contact position of the fingertips are different from all 4 instruments. Yes, we want to use our bones to push down because it's more solid than the fleshy parts. But as we go to the larger size strings and the larger size instruments, instead of pushing straight down near the fingernail, the viola's slightly in towards the flesh, cello's slightly in towards the flesh, bass is slightly in towards the flesh too. Their strings are wider and further apart, so they are more capable of doing that, and it's more comfortable. It's not going to cause as much pain for your players to do it that way.